I want to start today by acknowledging that I am seated on unceded Darug and Gundungurra country. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and you can see on the screen some of the beautiful creatures that live here alongside human animals. Now, when I was originally designing this presentation, I was going to spend a lot more time speaking about how some insects have been embedded in our culture as labor metaphors. However, as I began to outline my talking points, it became increasingly clear that I needed to spend more time addressing why insects should be regarded in the first place. Largely because there isn't really much out there on animals on insects in the animal studies lit, but certainly in the social sciences more broadly. There are notable exceptions, and for example, I hardly recommend Gunderman and White's paper, Critical Posthumanism for All. So this presentation then is less about labor metaphors and more sort of an exploratory talk about the reductive positioning of insects and how we might imagine a better future living alongside these incredible animals. The Proletariat revolution, if you will. Just briefly, following Gunderman and White, when I use the word insect in this presentation, I'll be using a colloquial rather than an etymological definition. A colloquial definition allows me to capture a range of animals that fall outside the class Insecta, but that are otherwise widely regarded as insects, and that elicit reactions from people that are sort of similar to that. So, for example, the centipede or the snail you can see on the screen. So, what do I mean when I talk about this reductive positioning of insects? Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that most people don't really seem to think too much about insects. We're living in a world where the reality of our coexistence has been disguised by pesticides and anti-parasitic medication and sanitized living spaces. It's possible to go an entire day without even noticing an insect. Of course, this has not always been the case. For example, Raber describes that the lifeways of past humans were more obviously entangled with animals, like tapeworms. Camporesi refers to this as a verminous universe unimaginable today. Unimaginable indeed. At some level, I feel a little funny presenting today because insects are usually so far below human consideration that the idea of advocating for them seems ludicrous. And yet, in an everyday sense, when we do think about insects, it's often when they bother or threaten us. You can imagine a fly buzzing in from the outside or a spider nesting in the corner of your kitchen. These insects are labeled as pests and are often killed for the simple crime of existing. And yet, often the threats presented by these animals are only perceived threats. Even when talking about dangerous insects, of course, humans are much more regularly lethal to them than they are to us. On the screen, you can see some examples of the kind of playful lethality that is directed towards insects, and that, if directed at almost any other animal, would be horrifying. We could also consider the industries that have been built up around this unquestioning subordination of insects. Pest control companies, for example, often position insects as invaders that threaten your family, creeping in from the liminal spaces of the human world to disturb, unsettle, or harm. An ecofeminist or Plumwoodian reading of these advertisements might question this idea of mastery. Mastery over whom and mastery for whom? What does this mastery presuppose? And further, we mobilize these logics of naturalized fear or disgust as justification for killing insects. Fear and disgust are sometimes used to justify harming other animals, but these discourses are especially pervasive to the extent that they have been medicalized and ultimately lethal for insects. The word insect itself is often used as a pejorative to refer to someone who is apparently deservedly worthless, and the names of particular species are often pejorative in their own right. Cockroaches, worms, ants, maggots. Examining this space highlights the human inequalities that intersect with the subordination of insects. For example, this vile and somewhat infamous piece by Katie Hopkins, where she compares refugees to cockroaches. When insects are mentioned in a positive light, discussions tend to revolve around their utility for human animals. Honeybees, for example, enjoy somewhat of a moratorium on human violence when encountered in parks or the backyard. However, this has been at the cost of them being significantly exploited in industrialized apiculture for their honey. In Australia, the apiculture industry is a $14 billion one. And more generally, I'm sure many of you have been exposed to arguments that situate insects as valuable because of the useful roles they play in our ecosystems. For example, arguments like, we need to think about the insects because they pollinate our food. These arguments are reminiscent of discourses about pets that relegate the value of a dog, for example, simply to their ability to make their owner happy. This is not to say that pollination isn't an activity on which many species depend, but I think that as long as we're counting insects as valuable only for their utility to humans, we are not meaningfully challenging their subordinate position under anthroparchy. Now, all of these messy and lethal relations are occurring in a context where many insects are dying, not just in everyday ways, as people spray flies or swat spiders, but systematically. This extinction crisis has been described as an insect apocalypse. And despite the fact that lots of really important work has been done in the natural sciences, we are nevertheless accelerating through this apocalypse into a world where many insects will simply no longer exist. So I would argue that the problem is not that we don't know enough about insects per se, but rather the ways we relate to these animals individually and institutionally are often fundamentally problematic. And so if the subordination of insects is socially constructed, then we need to become more aware of how we construct our relations with insects and, when necessary, affect to change them. In an attempt to become more aware of how we construct these relations, I am currently conducting a systematic literature review of the social sciences literature. I'm not nearly finished. As you can see here, there is a lot to get through, but already I am struck by the almost exclusively utilitarian approach to insects. An emerging theme seems to be this positioning of insects as mini livestock, a somewhat fashionable antidote to the climate crisis, and conveniently one which allows people to continue to eat animals rather than just stopping. And as per the title of this presentation, I have also been interested in how insects have been positioned as models for how humans should organize our own labor. In Insect Artisans and Their Work, for example, Steppe refers to insects as near pure distillations of industriousness. For Steppe, unlike birds or humans who require apprenticeship before constructing a nest or practicing a trade, insects are born ready to work. Steppe's insect is not an individual, but rather the latest member of a species in a long line of ancestors who themselves worked. In other words, Steppe's insect is primarily an economic one. Pasha Mammers argues that using human labor metaphors to describe the activities of insects serves only to delimit non-human lives and lifeways. The dynamic range of what it means to be an insect is effectively narrowed to the lifeways that, when considered by human animals, appear to interface with modern capitalism. Importantly, however, while the dynamic range of insect life is limited to industriousness, this reduction for writers like Steppe is perceived as a virtue. For Tasha and Mammers, these human labor metaphors tacitly trap humans by falsely asserting that capitalism is in some way natural or universal, and therefore as something that is inescapable. In this way, insect labor metaphors are a sort of modern morality tale. I think it's especially interesting that the animals that are often chosen as labor metaphors, so ants or bees, are those that appear to justify the colonial tendencies of capitalism as well. So those are some preliminary findings from my work, but what do we actually do about this? That is, how might we reconfigure this reductive positioning by moving toward a conceptualization of insects that more honestly engages with these complex animals? Well, if we go by 1954's Them, the revolution might look something like this on the left. If we go by the Empire of Ants, it might look like something on the right. But overall, I think a good start would be to dismantle institutions, discourses, and ideologies that justify subordination. In the meantime, while we work on that, I think there is also a lot of space to reposition how we view insects, to brainstorm creative ways that will allow sociologists to research insects and to ask ourselves tricky questions. I truly think that thinking with insects is revolutionary. As creatures that infest everything, our food, our eyebrows, our friends, they are an immediate rejection of Cartesian dualism and of anthropocentrism. They disturb and trouble the borders drawn around our homes and our identities, and their numbers and size are existentially troubling to humans who think themselves at the top of the species hierarchy. We have attempted to systematically exorcise these creatures from our lives, and in doing so have brought them to the brink of apocalypse. This thinking is both useful, therefore, and pertinent. Ultimately, however, I think the most effective tool we have at hand is our attention, and thinking about the wild and revolutionary imaginaries that we could cultivate by simply watching and learning from insects. I genuinely think it is a transformative act to sit there and notice whatever insects come across your senses. I have been incorporating this noticing practice into my PhD, and I have found it tangibly very, very helpful. Anyway, that is all for now. I'm only in the early stages of my studies, and I realize this was a bit chaotic and exploratory, but I'm genuinely very interested to hear what you all think. Thank you very much for your time.
Here is title screen of my presentation. So I'm calling it a social theory of everything, veganism as anarchism as anti-capitalism, and that title could continue forever, and I'll speak on that a little bit. I do want to mention the artwork here is by the artist Brett Colley, who is an art instructor at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, and that's because what I'll be presenting on today is a theory I am working on in a extended piece of writing, probably not quite book length, but if this gets to publication at some point, this will be the image that I use for the cover, and I have some details from it throughout. Okay, so the goals of this, what I'm going to try to cover is that in this piece of writing I am working on, I fundamentally assert that veganism is equal to anarchism and therefore vice versa, but that more importantly, both of these two terms should be brought together into the term veganarchism, and referring to veganism and anarchism separately, I think, is problematic. And one point of emphasis underlying veganism and anarchism already is commonly understood is this notion of anti-capitalism, and there are lots of such points of similarity. And so I would say that veganism and anarchism, again, is commonly understood, must necessarily be anti-capitalist. That should be taken as a given. I also want to assert briefly that veganarchism, as I theorize it, is what I consider a social theory of everything. And I'll nuance that a little bit, and then I'll talk about some political implications of this. So the basic point I want to make is that veganism and anarchism I do not consider complementary or merely compatible or even two sides of the same coin or two poles of a magnet or anything like that. I am not asserting similarity here. I am putting veganism and anarchism forward as exactly the same thing all the way through, always, already, and necessarily. No difference whatsoever. Now, for veganarchism, as I am putting this forward, I have this very basic, very tentative, very hesitant definition. And so I'm defining veganarchism as being against all oppressions everywhere, all of the time. And therefore, a veganarchist is simply someone who aspires towards this definition. And this should take into account people's personal circumstances, strengths, preferences, abilities, and so on. But the point is that this definition, again, that's extremely soft of veganarchist that I would put forward is aspirational. And again, this notion of aspiration has been put forward for both veganism and anarchism as well. Now, a little bit to the general theme of the conference is that anti-capitalism should underlie veganism, and anarchism should certainly be there in veganarchism, and obviously so. But it's simply anti-capitalism is not enough. I would assert that veganarchism, as the title would suggest, must be specifically anarchist. So socialist veganarchism to me is also an incoherent term. Anything that is not specifically anarchist. Now, the term this is so much else that I don't have time to nuance, but anti-capitalism itself is simply too unclear and too admitting of a term of other things that are problematic. So I think from as I try to describe veganism and anarchism, or veganarchism in particular, that veganarchism would be a social theory of everything, I think falls out automatically from this sort of definition or theorization. Everything that could be found within writings on veganism can also be found in writings on anarchism and vice versa. So I think everything that's in one is already in the other as theorized by various people. And I don't think that's difficult to find. I don't think we need a million sources to put that together. I think a handful will do, and maybe even less than that. But the point isn't to point out, particular texts that I think are holy grails or anything like that I think would go against this sort of theorization. But the point is, if we have two categories or conceive of two categories such as veganism and anarchism, if everything can be shown that's in one is also in the other, mathematically at least, that proves equality. And I would certainly argue that that is already the case. Now, when I want to put together a theory of everything, which I do, this can run into problems and critiques of universal theories of everything, such as that of the grand unified theory of physics and perhaps some others. And I'm certainly aware of those, and I'm not asserting veganarchism to be a universal theory. I prefer the word general theory or a generalist theory as opposed to universal. And I see veganarchism much more as an orientation, again, away from things like harm, and it is not prescriptive. Veganarchism would never tell anyone what to do in any case, unlike a grand theory of physics, which would prescribe to or purport to say how things exist in all situations, regardless basically of circumstance. Veganarchism would not do that, not whatsoever. And so a way I'm theorizing this veganarchism is largely in a negative sense, so against all oppression, right, everywhere, all the time. And so one thing I intentionally avoid, though, is making some sort of list, either the oppressions that it is against and trying to be exhaustive, or the things that veganarchism would be for, that it would support. And there are reasons for this. Both AFCO in Racism as Zoological Witchcraft and Badachi in their book Anarcho-Feminism critique lists, and for different reasons. Coe says that lists give the impression that these individual terms and movements are discrete, when in fact they are not, or certainly should not be. And Badachi says that lists are always finite and incomplete. And so someone would always add to a list and say, well, but you forgot this and you forgot that. So I think making a list, trying to actually explicitly draw out what veganarchism is for or against, would be a generally futile attempt. And so one example here, again, could be anti-capitalism. Not only should that be included, but not only is anti-capitalism itself not a sufficient term, but any sort of movement that is not explicitly anti-capitalist would be a contradiction in terms. And any movement that is not anti-capitalist, I don't think is actually a social movement for anything. It's in fact a way to keep everything the way it is. So we must be against everything all of the time, not some things part of the time or anything like that. And within veganarchism, as the social theory of everything, nothing would be given special status, nothing would be the most prominent, most foundational, nothing would have to be addressed first or anything like that. Again, it's everything all of the time. And I think that's the important orientation here. And so as I've tried to put this together, I think veganarchism is suitably flexible, versatile, and vague. And this takes guide from Ayanna Goodfellow's Radical Companionship, which also sets up something rather similar, but talks about the vagueness and how such a theory allows for critique and for growth over time to kind of ebb and flow as needed. So some social movement implications. I think the obvious one is solidarity. So the point here is for people to recognize if they are against one form of harm, they must necessarily be against all forms of harm, and therefore they are for every movement for social justice or freedom, and etc. So this pertains particularly to, I would say, vegans and anarchists, as they are often actually in practice hostile to each other, and that is severely problematic. And so what I really try to assert is that in doing what either vegans or anarchists are doing, they're already doing what the other one is doing. They're already involved in the same conversations, whether they know it or not. And so we're all doing the same thing, and we need to realize that. So I do prefer the term harm over anything else for this. It's really hard for me to choose terminology to describe this because I don't want to be too specific. Not only because vagueness helps incorporate growth, but also if you are specific, again, people can say, well, what about this? Or they can twist your words. So I'm really trying to avoid that. But I think combining ourselves into one movement against harm in general works. Now, that's not to say there aren't different foci within veganarchism. So people might focus on certain things or at certain times. But in general, I think there needs to be personal orientations against all modes of harm all of the time. So not fighting for one cause and only one cause, even if you personally believe in the rest. I think there needs to be messages out there that you also support every other sort of movement. And so following Coe, there's a number of things here. Separate movements I consider meaningless, in agreement with Coe, because as she says, a colonial mindset is built into separate social justice movements. So as soon as anything is considered separate, as soon as it does not include anything else, it becomes exceedingly problematic. And so trying to combine movements that are separate or consider themselves separate, again, doesn't seem to work. According to Coe, they end up not merging or being generative, but they clash, and that causes more problems. So veganism is not about saying we need to work together as separate movements, but that we are already the same movement, exactly the same movement. Yeah, and then at the end, a quote from Coe that further emphasizes this. So I really work Coe into this writing and trying to put together. So by way of a conclusion, I would assert that vegans who think they're vegans, who label themselves vegan, are not vegan unless they are also anarchists. And similarly, anarchists who say they're anarchists aren't unless they are also vegan. And I do think by some sort of generalization of veganarchism out from veganism and anarchism, that every movement must be equated in the same way that I equate veganism and anarchism. That is to say, they are always and already the same movement, and they have to be coherent. And so lastly, some forward-looking thoughts, which are a different chapter in this book, is I would say, and I do argue, although I am not tied to this in terms of others believing it, but that veganarchism would support things like comparing oppressions. I know that's a controversial topic, but I think it's actually not if we look at that the right way. I think it also supports antinatalism, which is to say not having children. And I think that works actually under all circumstances. And lastly, I do theorize veganarchism in a way that it supports human extinction. So I will end the talk on that note. Thank you.
Slaughterhouse capitalism, animal resistance and solidarity as the new basis for animal liberation. It was also very businesslike. The one watched it fascinated. It was pork making by machinery, pork making by applied mathematics. And yet somehow, the most matter-of-fact person could not help thinking of the hogs. They were so innocent. They came so very trustingly. They were so very human in their protest, and so perfectly within their rights. They had done nothing to deserve it, and it was adding insult to injury as the thing was done here, swinging them up in this cold-blooded, impersonal way, without a pretense at apology, without the homage of a tear. Now and then a visitor wept, to be sure, but the slaughtering machine ran on, visitors or no visitors. Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, 1906. I'm here today to argue for solidarity between humans and other animals as the basis for animal liberation. By solidarity, I mean an awareness of a shared struggle, of a unity of interest between humans and other animals regarding issues that affect and harm both of us. By solidarity, I mean that other animals are effective subjects with political acts of resistance that humans both can and should listen to and support. By solidarity, I mean explicitly the Marxist and leftist legacy of the term. I argue that fights against capitalism will inherently fail without an explicit inclusion of the non-human animal dimension, and in parallel, fights for animal liberation will never be successful without a rejection of capitalism as a mechanism of success. At a more fundamental level, by solidarity, I mean that the harm to human animals and other animals is shared and interwoven, and therefore fights for animal liberation are not a noblesse oblige, giving of rights from a more advanced group to the lesser brethren, but a clear awareness that we, all animals together, are in a shared struggle against slaughterhouse capitalism. Part 1, Animal Resistance. Surratt Collins' An Animal Resistance in the Global Capitalist Era chronicles how animals resist their domination, from escaping from slaughterhouses, to attacking their trainers, to simply choosing death over continued captivity. Animals fight against their oppression all the time. As Surratt writes in the very opening of her groundbreaking text, quote, "A cow and a calf flee a farm by swimming across a pond, running through a forest, and jumping over a high fence into a pasture of an animal sanctuary where they hide among a herd of horses. 4 baboons escape from a biomedical research facility by rolling a 15-gallon barrel into an upright position, climbing onto the barrel, and jumping over the enclosure walls. After being sold to become fast food, a chicken ensconced over the fence and travels 3 miles over 2 months to reunite with her best friend, a rooster named Hearst. These 3 viral stories, which all occurred within a month of each other, are not unusual. Each demonstrates and reflects a familiar pattern. Animals struggle against captivity. They fight, and their flights for freedom exploit a strong response from the public. Such defiant acts are forms of animal resistance. So the first principle of solidarity as a means of animal liberation is a recognition that animals are not voiceless, that we do not need to be the voice for the voiceless, but they do have language and they do speak. And moreover, that one of the ways that animals communicate is through resistance to their continued torture and captivity. In other words, fights for animal liberation are not only humans' fights for wholly passive subject without language or interest or agency, but instead in solidarity with the many non-human animals and what they tell us all the time that they want: not to be killed, not to hurt, to choose their own sexual partners or to have no partners at all, to be able to have their children stay with them, and the basic freedom inherent in the phrase animal liberation, the ability just to go and come as they choose. Part 2, Slaughterhouse Capitalism. I also intentionally choose the term solidarity to invoke the fight against capitalist exploitation, because there are similar linkages in the mistreatment of animals to issues of capitalism and worker exploitation. Indeed, even the assembly line itself that came from Henry Ford first studying the disassembly line of the Chicago slaughterhouse, where workers took apart the carcasses of the animals killed piece by piece. As Ford himself wrote in his autobiography, the Chicago slaughterhouse was, quote, the first moving line ever installed. The idea of the car assembly line came in a general way from the overhead trolley that the Chicago packers used in dressing beef. A promotional publication made by the Swift Company concurs with Ford's timeline, stating, quote, the slaughtered animals, suspended head downward from the moving chain or conveyor, pass from workman to workman, each of whom performs some particular step in the process. So efficient has this procedure proved to be that it was adopted by many other industries, as for example in the assembly of automobiles. And to be clear, these transitions from the disassembly line of the Chicago slaughterhouse to the regimented assembly line of the Ford car production were not mere historical coincidences. It was precisely the need to control and regulate the bodies of the animals to prevent their resistance to their own slaughter, to discipline the animal bodies into ever greater systems of control, once inspired the same technologies to do similar work to the human antibodies, killing. As James Stǎnescue has previously argued, quote, the companies didn't just need the hogs to submit. They needed to figure out how to make the workers submit as well. In other words, the division of the animal body into just a leg, just a throat, just a head, regimented and controlled, helped to inspire the view of the human animal body as just a hand, just an arm, which could be equally regimented and controlled. The violence and objectification of one type of animal body possessed within it the inherent seeds of the violence and objectification of the other type of animal body. The objectification of the animals being killed directly helped to lead to the objectification of the animals doing the killing. One type of technology for control could then be used from one animal to the other, from the non-human animal to the humans doing the killing. And once the Chicago disassembly lines had thoroughly objectified the human animal into mere component parts, disciplined and regimented against resistance, this controlled workforce, the same system of standardization and objectification, could be exported into the Ford assembly line and capitalist exploitation writ large. In other words, for the assembly line to be invented, there had to be a complete disavowal of the human, including the animal that is in the human themselves. The point is that both on the ontological level, the ability to see humans as mere bodies for consumption, and on the practical level of how to precisely control and regulate so many bodies, the world we live in now is not and should not be referred to as post-Fordist. The term post-Fordism suggests it was Ford what invented that which he merely borrowed. Instead, the age we live in is not post-Fordist as much as it is post-factory farm, or perhaps most accurately, post-slaughterhouse. What we have lived under since the 1900s is not post-Fordist capitalism, it is slaughterhouse capitalism. Such a change in language matters. Slaughterhouse capitalism reminds us that what the oppression and objectification and violence we see continuously recreated in so-called post-Fordist capitalism, the precise type of violence that Marx and others have spent so long critiquing, is not some type of quirk or mistake, some type of failure or reformable feature, but instead the original and foundational purpose of the entire system itself. As James Stǎnescue put it again, the term slaughterhouse capitalism serves to remind us that the capitalist system we live in derives not from, quote, the cleanliness of the Ford car factory, but instead from, quote, the blood-soaked reality of the stockyards. Moreover, part of the reason the Chicago slaughterhouse and the factory farm system were expanded in the first place, the problem such a system was created to solve, was to, in essence, buy off the working class with ever cheaper meat. Specifically, as the researcher E. Melanie Dupuy has extensively documented, the consumption of animal products became articulated in the 19th century as an example of white privilege, intended to differentiate white male workers from immigrants, primarily Chinese, who were competing for the jobs. As Dupuy phrases this argument, quote, the working class responded by defending its right to eat meat as a privilege of white citizenship. In essence, Dupuy's argument is in response to the newly unionized workers' demands for higher wages, which the workers articulated as necessary to buy meat for their families, a chicken in every pot. The state and the market responded, not by raising any workers' wages, but by funding and inventing ever new ways to bring down the cost of meat, allowing the workers to feel richer even as their actual wages have steadily declined. In other words, if we believe that necessity is the mother of invention, the necessity that the industrialized slaughterhouse and the CAFO system were invented to solve was the problem of workers demanding high enough wages to purchase meat, i.e., bring home the bacon. To directly connect the problem with this panel and this conference, the surplus value of the industrialized worker, whose wages were not raised and were steadily more exploited, were compensated by the surplus value of the animal, in which, as we've just discussed, the creation of the slaughterhouse, the steady ratcheting up of the exploitation of the animal body was intrinsically tied to the steady ratcheting up of the exploitation of the human animal body. Even as, in reality, under slaughterhouse capitalism, the workers became steadily poorer, part of the subjective feeling of wealth, their ability to buy ever cheaper meat steadily increased. In essence, under slaughterhouse capitalism, the animal is always exploited more, so that the human worker can always be exploited more. Again, as Dupuy phrases the same trade-off, quote, workers did not exactly win the fight over wages, but they did win the fight to eat meat, if not in the way they had imagined. Nor was this an isolated example. Continuously since the 19th century, the United States government has actively supported the consumption of ever greater amounts of animal products at ever cheaper meat. Meat has been negatively correlated with inflation for the last 40 years as a way to democratize meat consumption and to help Americans to feel ever richer, even as, in reality, wages have been stagnant or declining. Indeed, we see a continuation of the same policy today when during the height of the COVID pandemic, when virtually every business was shut down or curtailed, when even schools were closed, Trump signed an executive order to declare specifically meat packing slaughterhouses as sites of, quote, necessary for national security, so they could keep producing ever cheaper meat, even as the slaughterhouses were, of course, sites of some of the worst spread of the viral disease, so bad that management started taking bets on how many workers would contract COVID. Under slaughterhouse capitalism, the government understood the unspoken deal operating between the exploitation of workers and the exploitation of animals, and the role of the government and the market working together to always produce ever cheaper meat, no matter the harm to the animals, the workers, or society as a whole. Conclusion: solidarity forever. In this presentation, I have argued for the need for a new ethical and political basis to achieve animal liberation, based on a solidarity of a shared understanding and commitment to the shared interest human animals and other animals possess in fighting against objectification, Cartesian dualism, and economic exploitation. Moreover, I've documented part of the historical interweaving of race, gender, colonialism, immigration, worker rights, and class, with ever ratcheting up issues of the exploitation of animals. In particular, building on the work of James Stǎnescue, I've argued that we must reterm and rethink the exploitation experienced under post-19th century capitalism, from post-Fordist capitalism to slaughterhouse capitalism, as a means to highlight the reality that the capitalist system in general, and the assembly line in particular, exists to turn animal bodies into mere products, in which objectification, control, violence, and death are intrinsic to the original intent of the creation of the system itself. In contrast, animal liberation is the argument that all animals, including humans, are more than dead life existing for mere profit. It is the argument that all animals, including humans, are active subjects resisting their own oppression, and that only by continuously inventing new systems of regimentation and control is such constant resistance ever domesticated. That all animals, including humans, deserve bodily autonomy and consent. That all animals, including humans, are more than mere objects, more than just surplus value. That Cartesian dualism is an intrinsically flawed model for everyone. And that fundamentally, animal liberation is not some kind of noblesque of humans giving to their less fortunate animal brethren, but rather an emergency call against the slaughterhouse capitalism that is killing us all.